You're listening to Think About It with Pastor Peter Carbless.
Welcome to today's episode of Think About It with Pastor Peter Carbless. Peter, welcome back.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Rick.
So, Peter, we're going to diverge a little bit today. In the last few weeks, we've been going some deep dives on some quite meaty theological topics. So we're going to go a little bit lighter, and we're going to talk about what I guess we could call misquoted, misused and misunderstood scriptures, or some sayings that are sort of quoted as scriptural but in reality aren't. So a bit of a experiment here with wordplay and how words are used and perhaps even weaponized at times. Let's start with one that we hear a lot. God helps those who help themselves. Now, is there any scriptural foundation for that, or where's that coming from?
Well, it roughly echoes the sentiment, I think, or they're trying to draw on the sentiment that Paul would have expressed when he spoke about those in the early Christian communities who weren't pulling their weight. And he basically said, if a man does not work, neither let him eat. And that's a fair comment, which is Paul's way of basically saying, look, come on, be responsible and be a lifter, not a leaner. And basically, if people are leaners, that's not what they should be. And it's not wrong to be firm with people who are not pulling their weight when they can pull their weight.
But when people say this is often not what they're getting at.
No, most of the time I've heard that comment. It's usually said in conversations that are becoming a bit tense, where somebody's annoyed or they may be judgmental toward folk who are underprivileged and saying, well, look at the people who live in this situation or who live in that suburb. Look at the terrible way they're living, and if only they would do this, that, and the other thing, then they could be wealthy like us. And I've worked hard for what I've got, and why can't they do the same? And it's those judgmental, weaponized, as you said a moment ago, sentiments that I generally detect when anybody says that kind of thing.
Yeah, they're usually saying you're in the position you're in because of your own fault.
Yes.
So there's no empathy or sympathy in it. It's more sort of, help yourself. You can sort this out yourself. You don't need my help.
Yes, and if I'm going to get strong I'll about this, and I've got to be careful because not everybody says it is like this. But let me take a more extreme case of it, and that is, it often demonstrates a pathological selfishness where a person is trying to justify their self, that they are somehow a better, more superior person to the person who is living perhaps in an underprivileged community, or who has had, through no choice of their own, the family they were brought into, the circumstances they were brought into, no opportunities, and in fact are faced with abuse and discouragement and dysfunction right from the beginning.
A lot of people in our world can't help themselves.
No, many people can't help themselves.
So in that case, quoting this or saying this is almost trying to abdicate the responsibility to help others.
Yeah, precisely. And to a degree, it may even be demonstrating that they've become so socialised into a selfish way of life, they're unable to help themselves into having good character.
Another saying that I guess is similar, and I think sometimes indicates the same sort of heart condition, charity begins at home.
Yes. Well, actually, that's true.
It's not wrong.
Charity does begin at home, but it doesn't end there. And if charity ends at home, then we're dealing with pathological selfishness.
Yeah, again, it's often done to excuse themselves from helping. Because, they say charity begins at home, but often, as you said there, they're really saying charity ends at home.
Exactly. I think you're right about that.
So I guess I would look at Scripture in terms of those two sayings, and I see things like God saying, look after the orphans and the widows, and very clear New Testament teaching about looking after those who can't look after themselves. And the church actually pioneered that in a culture that was very against that. So the early church sort of really broke the mold of culture by saying, well, look, those people need help. That's what we're here for. It's
interesting you should say that, because if the church picked up that attitude of care for the orphans and the widows from the Old Testament, and interestingly enough, from the books that are often most neglected and most typified as legalistic, and therefore, that's law, so we're not into grace. They don't realise the depth of grace that is actually contained in the injunctions of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it's interesting if you follow through the studies on, for example, the distribution of property and how property matters and were to be looked after, the constant refrain is the Lord was saying, do this, 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 and this in the context of the world in which you live, and make sure that through this, the widows, the orphan, and here's the interesting, the sojourner, those amongst you who are not of you, are cared for as if they were you.
And that even included Gentiles.
Absolutely. Well, the sojourners by their
Were
name
Gentiles.
were Gentiles. They were the ones that were not you. And that's where Jesus, when he came in, he picked up that theme so beautifully, where he speak about loving even your enemies, doing good, right? And it's the absolute epitome of the kind of love that where we lay down our lives for one another, as Christ has called us to do in following him.
I think of what springs to mind for me is the story of Ruth and Boaz. And you see in there the clear biblical Old Testament teaching of the harvesters were not to harvest all the way to the edge of the field. They were to leave the edges, and anything that fell was to be left for the poor and the needy.
Yes, and the interesting thing, it wasn't limited to that, because if you go through and pull out all the things that speak about how you're to treat the widows, orphans, and sojourners, they were to be loved as yourself. And the interesting thing is that where Jesus quoted to love your neighbour as yourself, he actually pulled that quote right from what many people considered to be one of the most legalistic chapters in Leviticus, from Leviticus 19. We often don't realise that all of that Old Testament stuff needs to be read in the context of the culture of the times, and it had the same emphasis and focus of love that Jesus had, because remember, Jesus himself is the God who was contributing to what was told to Moses.
Okay, so let's leave those two with the thought that when you get on a plane, you are told, if the face masks fall down, fix your own, then fix someone else's.
Very good.
We use these as limiting statements to say we should stop at this point. Even as cultural sayings, they really should be taken as empowering to say charity does begin at home, but it must go on.
You begin with self-care in order that you are sufficiently healthy to care for others. If you don't do self-care, then you're going to depend upon others. So, of course, you must do self-care to make yourself healthy, fit enough, wealthy enough in order to be able to contribute to others. It's interesting, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28 says this, let the thief steal no more, but rather let him labour, working with his hands that which is good, in order that he may be able to give to him that has need. So the interesting thing is there that the thief, first of all, has to stop doing negative things. Well, there's a beautiful statement, when is a thief not a thief? And it's not when he stops stealing, because then all he is an unemployed thief. Right? Okay. A thief is not a thief when he works in order to have. There's your self-care. In order to provide, in order to the fact that you are able, you no longer need others to contribute to you, and then you keep going so you have surplus for the purpose of others. And until you have created a surplus from your own efforts for the purpose of giving to others, that's when you stop being a thief. And that's the life we're called into.
Yeah, so we're meant to be a river, not a reservoir.
A river, not a reservoir, exactly.
Okay, let's move on to another one. This is, again, a saying that is said and sort of sounds scriptural, but if you unpack it a bit, maybe not. Suffering is good for the soul.
Now, that's a good one. If suffering was good for the soul in an eternal sense, God would be planning for us to have it in heaven.
Not the plan I see.
Now, let me throw out, and again, this is a comment that needs modification. But I would say this, my retort in response to that is, no, suffering is not good for the soul. It is God that's good for the soul.
So the suffering in so much as it may lead us to a God response,
yes,
could be good.
Yes. You see, the thing is, my Bible at the end of it says that there will be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things have passed away. Behold, I make all things new. So God is looking for an ultimate outcome in which, as Jesus said the night before he died, that your joy might be full. God is a God of joy. God is a God of grace and a God of happiness and a God of delight. That's what he's wanting to bring us into, a place of safekeeping. But if we are living lives that are unloving, then we're not going to contribute to that. We're going to pollute that. And it may be God taps us on the shoulder and says, hey, come on, we need to go in a slightly different direction. Now, that tap might be very hard. We might get a sore shoulder out of it. That kind of suffering is not God's ultimate intent. They may be the processes of discipline, such as you see occur at referred to at the beginning of Hebrews chapter 12, right? God says, God disciplines us as sons, not because he wants to introduce pain into our lives, but because he wants to divert us into a life that is loving, productive, generous, and creates communities in which the joy is full.
Yeah, so the suffering in itself is not something to be desired, but it's something that could lead us on to other things. There's suffering for a good reason, and there's suffering because of bad choices.
Yes, and if you look at it, the word suffering itself comes from a Latin root, sub ferro. Sub means under, ferro means to bear under. Mm-hmm. And so there is a sense in which there is the character development that comes and we have to bear under. For example, let's say the disciplines of parenthood, which sometimes can be heavy and hard and difficult. Then in that sense we will suffer that to be done unto me. Jesus said, "Suffer the little children to be brought to me." Bear under for the children to be brought to me, because I'll contribute my life to them, and I'll change my agenda. I won't just be serving myself. I'll be looking after them. In that sense, that kind of sub-ferro, that kind of bearing under, that is good for the soul because it's character development. But the idea that somehow or other the painful things of their nature are good for you, and to justify that as a reason for enduring sickness and thinking somehow or other the sickness is good for me, we get into some contradictory statements that they're often not helpful.
Yeah, a lot of things, and we've talked about this a few times through our discussions, is a lot of it comes back to intent.
Yes.
If you're an athlete and you're trying to build up to, do something amazing in the athletic world, there's going to be some suffering in that.
Yes.
You're going to put up some pain. You're going to have some sore muscles. You're going to feel it. It's going to hurt. But you do it for the goal set before you. And you know that the more you do it, done properly and sensibly, that pain will ease and you become more able to deal with running at that pace or jumping that height or whatever it may be. And it's a bit the same. If you're just suffering, in your circumstances and it turns you just into a wallowing self-pity party, that's not good for your soul.
No. Neither is it good if I'm looking at somebody who is suffering and saying, oh, well, God has a purpose in this is good for them, so I won't help them. Or that gives me a justification for somehow or other neglecting them. I've seen that happen as well. That's where those phrases are abused. But I agree with you. The things that stretch us and cause us to grow are important. I'll tell you a funny thing about that. A couple of days ago, now I'm not the world's greatest athlete or exerciser. In fact, sometimes that's quite an object of guilt in my life rather than pride. But on one particular day, I've got this smartwatch, as we do, and I've got my little app on the thing, and I love watching it. And I got a warning the other day because I had really pushed myself hard one day. And a little warning came up and said, you did too much exercise yesterday.
You think I don't get told that very often.
Don't get told that very often. But the point is that the issue is everything's got to be kept in balance, in moderation. And so the idea that suffering is good for the soul, well, okay, in one sense there is some suffering that is good for the soul. But there's lots of suffering that's not good for the soul, because ultimately it's God that's good for the soul. But the point is that the intention, the motivation behind the statement, it can be a statement that doesn't understand God's desire for us to know the fullness of joy. And so we think, oh, okay, well, then I've got to put up with this is what God's will is for me. Well, no, that's not helpful. If it's also used to justify neglecting others because I think, oh, well, their suffering's good for them, then that's not helpful either. But if it's used in the sense that this is extending my character and I'm growing through this, then that is helpful.
Yeah, that was the thought actually I was just having, is sometimes we use it as an excuse to look at someone and say, oh, that's good for them, they're suffering. Whereas actually what God's trying to say is do something about it.
Yes.
It's actually a prompt to us to intervene in that suffering, to turn around their suffering and help them.
Yes.
So, we can use it as an opt-out, but maybe it's a trigger that we should act.
We're here to bring them comfort and to be kind. And you can't do that too much.
That's true. You can't be too kind.
No.
Okay, we might just wrap up that episode there because I think that's a good little start to these conversations we're going to have these next few. And I think what we'll do in the next one is actually go into some actual scriptures that are quoted, misquoted, abbreviated, if you like, to where their meaning changes.
Yeah, decontextualised and distorted.
That sounds like a great word. Okay, Peter, we'll be back next time.
Think About It with Pastor Peter Carbless is a production of Rema.cc.